slideshow set up just to talk about the main topic of why we use buyer agency and why it's important. I'm not going to go so much into the actual buyer agency agreement. It's a pretty simple agreement for you to fill out. And when you want some help, you can either go to one of our YouTube videos on the buyer agency agreement, or you can call Steph or me, and we can walk you through it. But today I'm really going to talk about what the concept of buyer agency is and why it's important to use it. And I have a fear that a lot of agents are using it, but not really knowing why or the need of it or what the alternative is to the buyer agency agreement. So in order to use the correct terminology, to use the correct behavior that you have with a buyer, that's what we're going to talk about today, is the nitty-gritty of buyer agency. So I'm going to go to hi, Steph. So talking about the importance of buyer agency and why we are using it, why we have to why we're using it and what the implications are of using it, what your responsibilities are in using it. So that's our conversation today. Buyer agency is a relationship created when a buyer agrees that an independent agent may act on his behalf in a purchase or rental transaction. So the agent's going to act on the behalf of the client. It becomes a fiduciary agreement where the buyer becomes a client of the agent's brokerage. It's not a direct client of you, the agent. It's a client of Keller Williams. And you are the representative of Keller Williams in this buyer agency. Its twin sister is a listing agreement. That's the other agreement that we have, where it is a fiduciary agreement and the seller is a client of Keller Williams. And you as the agent are the representative of Keller Williams as the real estate agent. So those two associations of fiduciary agreement are equally important, the listing side and the buyer agency side. So these are the things that you literally need to review when you are debating whether you're going to have buyer agency. As I said, a lot of agents today just assume that they're going to do buyer agency and practice it, but not really understanding the why and maybe the why not of practicing buyer agency. So you should practice it because most buyers don't know the difference and they're assuming that you're already representing them. This used to be a situation before buyer agency was polished up to be a good law in the state of Wisconsin. Every buyer thought that every real estate agent represented them when they didn't. Before we had the agreement, actually all the agents represented the seller. They were a sub-agent of the seller or the listing brokerage. But when we really polished up the practice of buyer agency with the agreement to sign with the buyer, then we made that distinction. This is the only time an agent is representing the buyer, is when they have buyer agency. When you have buyer agency, and this is why you should practice it, you can use your negotiating skills, and you can use all the statistics in MLS, and you can use all of your knowledge of neighborhood markets and do all of that sort of analysis for your client. So it's a freedom, and it is a good freedom that you can actually do when you don't have to keep quiet. It does build better business relationships, having a client rather than having a customer. It maintains your natural relationships. It's very hard to treat members of your family or good friends or new first-time buyers as a customer, because they're the ones that it's going to be very hard for you to only use the customer responsibilities. You certainly don't want to do that with your family, with your sister or an aunt. You're very good friends. You want to be able to give them all the services that you as a licensed real estate agent have. First-time buyers need your services more than really any other type of buyer. And so you really must be practicing buyer agency with them so that you can give them your negotiating, your analysis, your real estate opinions. Other people that you should be practicing buyer agency are if you have a listing and those sellers are now out looking for a new property, they are clients on the listing side, and so then they should be clients on the buying side. Past clients, it's very hard to treat a past client as just a customer. Another buyer is the relocation. If you're doing any referrals of relocation, they desperately need your skills as a licensed buyer's agent about talking with finding locations where they're going to buy, being able to compare values and things like that. Those opportunities are very, very hard to do when you're just working with a customer. And remember that this is a legal document. You can be held liable if you give customer agent representation when you are a sub-agent of the listing. So if you don't sign a buyer agency with them and you are working with them as a customer, if you do any negotiating for them or if you do any analysis for them, you can be sued because you're really supposed to be representing the seller or the listing firm on the other side. And this is where we want to make sure that you understand the difference between client and customer. If you are working with your client, then you have all the responsibilities of buyer agency. If you didn't sign a buyer agency agreement, you're working with them as a customer, and you really cannot give them a lot of those services, especially negotiating, because you are legally representing the other side. You're legally representing, say, Shore West as the listing company or the seller. So this is a critical situation where I think a lot of agents have not understood the distinction. There are times when you meet a buyer and you say, maybe I don't want to be a buyer's agent for this buyer. Maybe I do want to just represent them and only as a customer relationship. I'll be representing the seller in this situation, even if it's with a different firm. Because those buyers are ones that will not be loyal. They hop from agent to agent. They go to open houses and talk up every single listing agent there, wanting to write an offer. Maybe they have needs that you cannot meet. Their expectations are they want to buy $200,000 house for $100,000, and you just know that this is not going to work. We're not going to be able to meet our responsibilities with them. So you don't work with them as a client, you keep them as a customer, and you have to sign the customer relationship form And when you write an offer with a customer, you have to send that disclosure of customer relationship along with your offer. You don't have to send a disclosure when you're with a buyer's agent because it's in the contract. But if they're a customer, you got to make it really clear to the listing agent, I am actually representing your seller. I am not representing this buyer. Any questions on that? Okay.
Yeah, real quick. So if you don't have buyer, well, you typically, and this is not myself, I actually have 100% success rate with buyer agency, but
Good.
not that I have many clients, but it's what I had a question. So if the only time it really matters, for the listing agent side, like you said, is if you go forward and make an offer, but you don't have buyer agency at that point, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah, because I know traditionally a lot of agents I worked with, which is I don't advise this, and I don't think you do either. A lot don't do buyer agency until before the contract.
It depends. It depends on the person. If I say, if they're family or they're first-time buyers or they're relocating from a different company area, you might want to have an early agreement to be a buyer's agent with them because they're going to need that extra service. But someone who is maybe bought and sold before, they're still deciding, you're still deciding, you can wait until you're actually writing the offer to get the buyer agency agreement signed. Because you want to be on that line one of the offer to purchase. When you write it, you want to be able to state you're either representing the buyer or you're representing the seller, or the third choice is you're representing both sides, which we don't agree with. So a lot of people just wait till they do it because, as we will continue to talk about, the main skill of practicing buyer agency is negotiation. All right. So we just talked about it, Sheridan, though she brought it up. At the first meeting or at a buyer consultation, this is very important. This is when you introduce the choice to the buyer. You don't have to sign a buyer agency agreement at this first meeting or at your buyer consultation, but you have to talk about the choice they have, either to be a customer or a client, and the comparison of their choice. I have on the screen to share, I'll do it later, there is a brochure that you can give this buyer from the WRA that explains a lot of the distinction between being a buyer's client or a customer. And it's a really good brochure to give to this buyer at the time of the buyer consultation. You don't have to sign it at this point, but you definitely have to introduce the choice at the first meeting. When you're talking about using buyer agency, introduce the importance of negotiating, a skill that you will develop as you go, unless you've had a previous career where negotiating was very critical and important. I always say if you have children, you're probably already good at negotiating because they're probably the best negotiators. But it is a skill that you really need to build and develop as a real estate agent, because you are going to be representing this client's biggest expense, biggest amount of money, wish, dream, all of those things are based on your skill in negotiating. So that's the purpose of having an agent. An agent is a go-between between a consumer and a supplier, and arm's length perspective is usually the best in those situations. That's why movie stars and sports figures and everybody has an agent, because it's easier for an agent to negotiate a deal rather in third party agreement rather than direct negotiation. That's why it's really difficult for a for sale by owner to sell his house, because he doesn't have that perspective of arm's length. He's too subjective in the deal. A buyer can sign the agency agreement when the buyer is ready to make an offer, or earlier if the buyer wants the benefits of the agent's expertise advice. Okay. Now, in your pre-licensing courses, they drilled this over and over about what your duties are to a customer, and then what your additional duties are, in addition to the customer duties, what the additional duties are to a client. So this is something you really had to understand and learn before you took your real estate exam. And it is critical in the buyer agency agreement. In fact, it's written in the buyer agency agreement. All the customer duties you have, provide to everybody fairly and honestly. You are to exercise reasonable skill and care, provide accurate information. You are obligated to disclose in writing material adverse facts. This is something that is special to Wisconsin, is to protect confidentiality. We provide confidentiality to both customers and clients. It is our duty to safeguard trust funds. And this is very important, to present contracts in an objective and unbiased manner and disclose the advantages and disadvantages of the proposal. Those are services that you can provide to a customer. But when you sign the buyer agency agreement, you add to those duties of a customer additional provide an advice information on real estate matters. You cannot do that with a customer. You can provide all material facts affecting the transaction, not just adverse material facts. You must provide and fulfill obligations and lawful requests that are within the scope of the agreement. So whatever your client wants, as long as it's lawful, you have to fulfill those obligations. You really have to, the old word was obey. You are to negotiate for the client. And it is very critical in our code of ethics and in these duties. An agent will not place their interests ahead of their client's interest. You're not going to be looking for the bigger commission. You're not going to be looking for the bigger deal. You're not going to be looking for ease and comfort. You will not place your interests ahead of the client's interests. And we brought up these boxing ring analogies. I don't think any of us box, but I think this analogy is a really clear one that you can show to your buyer and give them the difference. So when you have buyer agency, you picture a boxing ring, and the seller and the buyer are outside the ropes. They're watching. And what they're watching is inside the ring, the listing agent and the buyer's agent are negotiating. They're doing the boxing, representing their clients. So the listing agent representing the seller, buyer's agent representing the buyer are in the ring negotiating. If you are not a buyer's agent, if your buyer is a customer, the seller and you, the sub-agent for the buyer, are outside the ropes. And you're watching the boxing going on between the listing agent, who's representing the seller, and the buyer customer. Your buyer is in the ring negotiating with the listing agent. So that is when you are treating your buyer as a customer. That customer has to negotiate for himself with the listing agent. And sometimes that's not a bad deal. Sometimes it's like an investor. He goes, I know what I'm going to offer in my offer. I know what terms I'm going to use. I've done this a million times. I don't need you to negotiate for me. I know how to do this. And I know exactly what I'm going to write in my offer. In those situations, if they want to be a customer, you can definitely sit outside the ropes with the seller. But I do put a star on this skill, and I can't drill enough. We're going to be doing some more training in contract training on negotiating. but learn how to negotiate. It means to provide your client all of the information, your skill, and your training in acting as an intermediary between the parties. So like I said, you are getting inside the boxing ring, using your skills, your information, and your knowledge. You are giving advice or opinion on matters which are material to meeting your client's needs. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I do have a question. So, well, I'm curious how often that actually happens, that someone wants to negotiate on their own behalf directly with the listing agent. Is that fairly common?
It is, I wouldn't say it's common, but it is, you'll see it very much in with investors or flippers, because they know what they're going to spend, they know what the process is, and they want to be treated as a customer, mainly because they don't want to be loyal to you either. They usually want to use any agent that suits their needs the best. So they don't want to be tied in an agreement with one agent. They want to stay as a customer so they can kind of bounce around. That's probably the most common time when you are working with a customer.
So
there are other people too that just don't understand the difference. You've got to educate the buyers as to the differentiation.
Yeah, and your responsibility then, you would fill out the contract, but they would present it, or how does that end?
No, you still present it. They will basically tell you what to put in the contract, because you can't negotiate for them. So you just fill out the contract the way they want it, but you do present it to the listing agent.
Okay.
You can't, and the listing agent says, we don't like that, we're coming back with a counter, you receive the counter and you give it to your customer.
Okay.
And the customer can do whatever they want with it. But you're still acting as the agent. You're just not acting, you're not representing that buyer.
Got it.
Okay. Another thing that's really important in negotiating is knowing the documents and knowing how to complete them properly. And that's one of the things that Steph and I are here to make sure that we can help you. If you're not sure how to use which document or what document needs to be filled out, please call us. Please take the opportunity to make sure that you are negotiating for your client correctly. Presentation of your client's proposal to other parties clearly and accurately. If you are a buyer's agent, you have to know how to present this to that listing agent. You have to talk about your sales. I mean, this is where salesmanship actually comes in. You're not selling a house to a buyer, you're selling your buyer's wants to the seller. So you as a salesman are talking about the best parts of your offer, the benefits to the seller if they accept this offer, and everything has to be written and delivered clearly and accurately. No vague offers or mistakes. And that is the importance, and that is the bottom line, I think, main need for being a buyer's agent. Any questions here? Okay, so now we get to the part where everybody's confused. And Steph and I have gone over this many times, and I'm just going to briefly go over it again. In the buyer agency agreement and in the listing agreement, the clients of Keller Williams have a choice. And they're given 3 choices to mark in their listing agreement or to mark in their buyer agency agreement. So it's about multiple representation. And that means it's more than one Keller Williams client. Has nothing to do with Colbrooks. As if the seller is from Ogden, there's no such thing as multiple representation. Multiple representation is only when the seller and the buyer are working as a client with a Keller Williams agent. There is no multiple representation if the buyer is a customer, because they are not representing them. So this is a main confusion a lot of agents have. It is not multiple representation with a listing seller who is in a contract with Keller Williams and a customer buyer, because they are not represented by Keller Williams. Multiple representation is when you have both clients. The seller is a client with a listing contract and the buyer is a client with a buyer's agency. I think that's the most common misunderstanding that Steph and I field when we get these questions. So moving on to that, you have the three choices. So the first choice is multiple representation with designated agency. And that's the one we all recommend, because that means a buyer writes an offer on a Keller Williams listing. The buyer's agent is the designated agent for the buyer, and the listing agent is the designated agent for the seller. You want your buyer, when they're filling this out in the buyer agency agreement or in their offer, to understand that designated agency means we can use two Keller Williams agents to represent either both sides, the buying side and the listing side. It's not necessarily just a double pop where it's your listing and your buyer representation. It's any Keller Williams agent who has a listing and any Keller Williams agent who has a buyer agency agreement. That one is designated for the buyer and the listing agent is designated for the seller. Both buyer agency agreement and listing agreement have to agree when this multiple representation happens. If they do not agree, one client must change their choice to become a customer. Usually the buyer changes. But this is the recommended choice, the one on top, because this is the way it's set up. And it's really important for Keller Williams agents to understand this. Keller Williams has a lot of listings, a lot of very good listings, and more listings than a lot of other companies. Keller Williams also has some very prolific buyer agents and teams. So because Keller Williams is set up to have so much of this multiple representation, that is why we want your buyer's client and your seller client to choose multiple representation with designated agency, or number one. Now, sometimes they don't. If either client is marked box 2, the firm can represent both parties, but then the firm must remain neutral and not offer agency duties to either client. Parties must agree on the agency choice, and if they don't, then you change it with an amendment. Now, this is really tough because if they mark they don't want designated agency, they understand that Keller Williams has multiple representation, but they say, no, we don't agree with designated agency. That just cuts, it cuts your services off right at the ankles, because that means neither the listing agent nor the buyer's agent can offer any negotiating, any skills, any analysis, any opinions, because they both have to remain neutral. They can't work as a designated agent. That's box 2. And if you have box 2, you must schedule the showings yourself, because if you have a Keller Williams agent wanting to show it, you have to make sure that they know that there's no designated agency if you're the listing agent. Now, the third choice is even actually more limiting, because it's rejecting multiple representation at all. The firm cannot represent either party in the same transaction as a client. So that means if you have a listing and your seller is a client, but they choose box 3, that means that if you are Keller Williams agent and you have buyer representation, you have to change that buyer to be a customer to even put an offer in on this listing. And that's very difficult. Someone who wants to choose you as a representative agent then finds out that the seller is not going to allow multiple representation. It forces you to say to your buyer, you have to be my customer now. I can't represent you. Or go to Shore West and work with an agent over there because we can't represent you the way this seller wants to be represented. So we don't want our sellers or our buyers to limit, especially sellers, to limit the possibilities of buyers. And that's why box number 1 is preferred, because it allows Keller Williams agents to work with clients of sellers and to work with clients of buyers. Now, the choice not recommended is dual agency. And it's pretty much the same as box 2. If you have a listing and say you're having an open house and some buyers walk in and they like you, they like the way you work, they even kind of like this listing, but they want to be represented. You cannot, and this is, a lot of agents want to double pop it. They want to get the commission on both sides. But that means that you can't have agency with both of them. If you do, you have to remain neutral. You really can't use your agency skills with either one of them. You can only exchange paper back and forth. So in this situation, if you have a listing and you have some buyers that want representation, you cannot do it, but what you can do is designate another agent in Keller Williams to work with these buyers as clients, and then make sure that both parties agree to multiple representation with designated agency. And then that designated Keller Williams agent can give that representation to these buyers. And you and this other agent can work out any kind of agreement you want. You can offer to split the buyer commission, any kind of thing like that. But you really need to designate if you have a buyer client and on your listing with your seller client.
I do have one question on that. So multiple
Good.
representation without designated agency, essentially, so if your client does not want to have an agency, they could be theoretically a customer, right? But
Correct.
if they also don't want to deal with the listing agent, that's when they would pick that, correct? Pretty much, because then they can't have the listing agent negotiate directly with them.
Well, what it really means is if they don't allow designated agency, you're right. They have to, and you really can't change a seller to be a customer. So the seller has to stay a client in the listing, but a buyer has the option to change and be a customer so that it's no longer multiple representation. But it means the buyer loses out on being represented because you can't designate another Keller Williams to work with it.
Right, but so like say if you had a client who wanted that, you would have to tell like say someone has a listing agent. I don't know if anyone would ever go for it. I don't know. That just seems kind of strange. I imagine it's investor to investor kind of thing.
Yeah, it is. And the mistakes that I've seen with some of our agents who choose box 2 on a listing agreement is they don't want another Keller Williams agent to represent them. They and the seller and this agent think they have to go through me. And that's a misunderstanding. And I've had to correct some agents when they have that feeling. That's not what box 2 means. Box 1, that you can designate a client of a buyer and a client of a seller, is the best representation to give every seller and of course every buyer. The other case you'll see where box 2 is checked is when it goes to an attorney. And usually they're not real estate attorneys, and usually they don't understand this box, but they think that the seller should have total control. So they don't want designated agency. But really, I think they just don't understand it, the concept. But I will see, and Steph and Kimmy and I have seen, when box 2 is marked, it's usually because there's an attorney behind the scenes. So any other questions about this? And again, if you're stuck and this is happening in real time, give us a call, because we'll be happy to shake out the situation that you're in specifically. Now, I'd mentioned this buyer agency brochure that actually you can get right out of Zip Form in their forms. It's buyer agency agreement is in there, and the buyer agency brochure. However, I made this chart years ago, and I've continued to update it, and clarify it. But it's a simple chart that shows the differences between being a sub-agent and being a buyer's agent. So when you're at a buyer consultation with your first buyer, this is a good way to explain buyer agency and what happens if you want to be a customer and what happens if you want to be my client. So these are the things that I can do with you as a customer, and then the additional things that I can do with you as a, as a client. So as you can see on the chart, we can all arrange showings, assist with financing, provide property data, explain the forms and agreements, monitor the closing, and prepare a CMA. You can prepare a CMA for a customer and for a buyer's agent. You just can't really get into the analysis of it. But with a client, you can provide access to the entire market, listed and for sale by owner, in the agreement, or you can modify that. I don't agree with letters to owners. Oh, that's letters to owners that aren't listed. Say if you want to scan a neighborhood, and you can send letters to the owners saying you may have a buyer that might be interested in this neighborhood or whatever. I agree with those. As a buyer's agent, you promote and protect the buyer's best interests, advise the buyer in terms of the offer. Again, key, you negotiate the best price and the terms for the buyer, that you actually have strategies on what you're doing. You can point out reasons not to buy as a buyer's agent. You absolutely cannot do that with a customer. You can explain the pros and cons of the appraisal contingency, the right to cure, title issues, testing, financing contingencies, and the offer to purchase. You really can't provide those services for a customer. They're pretty much on their own as they fill out the terms of their offer. As a buyer's client, you can explain the pros and cons of using the addendum O or addendum R. If occupancy or rental terms are important in this offer. Check, actually, not only can you do this, but it's pretty much an obligation to do this, is to check with the municipality on current news or issues with the property. Go look up the property in the municipality and make sure that you find all the information that your client, the buyer, needs to know. But the customer and the client can follow through on all terms and dates, and everybody, as I said, this is unique to Wisconsin, and maybe there are a couple of other states, but we keep all sides confidential. So it's a handy little chart. You can get it out of our global library. And if not, just let me know and I can send it to you also. So this is important. Before you represent a buyer as a client, before you hand over the buyer agency agreement, WB 36, to this buyer, make sure you understand it. Make sure you review it, all the sections, and that you can explain each and every one of those sections in the buyer agency agreement to a buyer. Don't present it unless you fully understand that WB 36. Compliance, that's Steph and me. We're open to explain and help with any questions about the agreement or with any dialogue to explain to buyers. I'll even do a one-on-one with you if you are about to present a buyer agency for the first time, and we can go over the things to say and how to fill it out. As I said, the buyer agency agreement is an easy agreement form to fill out, but make sure that you understand it before you start using it. Especially know how to explain how you will be compensated and when, if ever, the client will be responsible to compensate you. One of the first questions that buyers have who have no experience, when presented with a buyer agency choice, they'll say, what is it going to cost me? And how much am I responsible for? And that's where you should be able to explain that section if and when it ever comes up. So I have just quickly okay. Can you all see the buyer agency agreement?
We can.
Okay, good. As I said, I'm not going to go over it in detail. I'm just going to look at the different sections. And again, if there's a section in here that you don't understand or you can't explain to a buyer, give us a call. We'll be happy to go through it with you, or just even answer questions directly. So this can be used for people who are renting as well as people who are purchasing. And that's why it's called Buyer Agency Tenant Representation Agreement. So if you're working with renters, you can use that same kind of relationship with a person that is going to rent as you can with a person who's going to buy. So you have the exclusive authority to act as a buyer's agent. And you strike the one that you're going to be using. Client agrees. Go ahead.
You know what? I have a question. So
yes.
I have some rental properties. Since I'm an agent, so normally I'll just show them, right? Before I'm an agent. Do I have to go through this since I'm theoretically an agent? I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to make a commission on my own property, I guess.
If you have rental properties, do you have them listed with Keller Williams?
I do not, no.
Okay. All right. Well, that is sort of an arrangement you need to have with Keller Williams. But if they were listed, then you would be working as the client for the person who owns the property, and you would not want to sign a tenant representation agreement because, again, that would be dual agency.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Okay.
I guess the other thing is because normally I don't advertise via the MLS because it's so easy on like rental.com. Is that something I need to do since I'm an agent, or it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I can't make that decision for you because I'm not sure Keller Williams policy. I think it's a question you need to ask either Kimmy Herbert or Charlie.
Okay, all right, good to know.
On your responsibilities on that.
Yep.
Okay. So anyway, going on, it says the purchase price range. This is not a binding range, and this is something a lot of agents are not sure about. If you put in, we're going to be looking between, say, 300 and 385 or something, and they find a house that's 400 and they write an offer on it. That does not negate the buyer agency agreement. So the purchase price range is not a binding term in this agreement. Here it says the firm's authority under this agreement extends to all properties within the state of Wisconsin, except for the excluded ones. So this next section, excluded properties, this is where you put down properties that you're not going to be looking for. And this is binding. A lot of times agents will put, they're not going to look for sale by owners, or they will modify it by saying they'll work with for sale by owners only if those were brought to the attention by the buyer. So say the buyer's driving around and he sees a for sale by owner sign, he lets you know about it. Now you can work as his agent on that. But to work with all listed properties in the state of Wisconsin, including for sale by owners, that is a huge responsibility to take on. So you might want to put some geographic limitations on it, like I'm only going to work, north of I-94, whatever. Or you can put the types of properties, like I'm not going to work on duplexes, or I'm not going to work for sale by owners, but you can modify your buyer agency agreement to sort of make sure that you are on the same page. An excluded property subject to a prior agreement, that's if you were if your buyer was working with another agent as a buyer's agent, those properties are protected, just like in the listing contract, buyers are protected. So properties are protected if they were working with another buyer's agent prior to you. Again, limited exclusion properties. And these properties are excluded from this agreement until maybe it was something they had some kind of an agreement on. You give them a date that agreement will expire. So you can say within 2 weeks or a week or something like that. And you put down the addresses of the properties and the date limitations. Compensation. Now, this is when we talk about, does the buyer owe you any money? You can put down as a commission to be equal to what they're offering in MLS. So you can say 2.4% of the purchase price, or as offered in MLS. So that means, say, if you're working with something that is not an MLS, you are still going to get 2.4% of the commission. And that means that if you don't get 2.4%, that the buyer will have to make up the difference. So if MLS is only offering 2% and you have 2.4, and you don't say or anything else offered by MLS, if you just have 2.4%, and their own MLS is only offering 2%, your buyer has to come up with the 0.4 to you. So this is where it gets into what do I owe? What do I have to pay? So it talks about how this commission is earned, when it is due and payable, and how it's calculated. And it's best to use a percentage commission on how it's calculated. Now you can put in other compensations. I don't recommend this until you are a really good buyer's agent, until you really know how to negotiate and have good skills, that you are very valuable buyer's agent. Then you can ask for additional compensation. And that's usually in the form of a dollar amount. So like, could be covering the cost of your administrative work, like $295 or something. But again, I think you need to make sure that you can earn that additional compensation. So here, payment by owner or owner's agent. So it's just making sure that, especially if things are listed in MLS, that the listing firm is authorized to pay you commission. If it's a for sale by owner, it can be the owner is going to pay you the commission. Earnest money. Good thing to use is trust funds out of MLS. But the firm that holds the trust funds in connection with the transaction shall be retained by the firm in the firm's trust account. So you're all pretty familiar with that. Now remember, this agency agreement is with Keller Williams. It is not exclusive to you. It is a Keller Williams agency agreement, and you are the representing agent with Keller Williams. So don't think of this as all yours, because you're sharing it with the firm. So that's what this talks about, the firm's duties and the cooperation. And then here we are again with the explanation of the disclosure to clients and the additional duties owes to you as a client of the firm. And then it gets into explaining, just like we talked about, multiple representation relationships and designated agency. So there's an explanation of those choices of what multiple representation means and what the designated choices are. And then they are here for your client to fill out in this form. And hopefully this is the recommended one, number 1. Talks about sub-agency, any confidential information the buyer wants to have in writing. I think that's hardly ever used. Talks about all of the characteristics of the relationship that you have. Then a whole section on definitions, definitions of what an adverse fact is, what it means to negotiate the acquisition of an interest in the property. All of these things are what we are saying. Make sure you review this entire agreement before you roll it out in front of a possible client or a buyer. Now, this whole section talks about rental. So this is the section you'd fill out if you're going to rent. Then the last part, important part, talks about delivery. Most of us are using email or electronic delivery at this point. Any additional provisions, any addendum attached, and then this is the term of the agreement. I wouldn't make a buyer agency agreement really long, like 6 months or a year. I would keep it in parcels because things change. So maybe a 3-month is probably the longest, but it's up to you and this buyer on how you think you'll be able to react or how quickly you'll be able to find a property for them. And again, the client's signatures and your signature has to be on this. Now, if there are any changes to be made to this, there is an amendment to the buyer agency agreement, just like there's an amendment to the listing agreement. But the concepts are similar, and Steph and I are available to work with you and help you if you need any assistance in doing your first buyer agency. So, any questions?
You know what? I have another one. Sorry.
Oh, I'm happy you are. Thank you.
So I guess I have a unique situation. I have a client who is in Illinois. So obviously it's not my client and I'm looking to refer them out.
Mhm.
Do I need buyer agency in order to refer someone to prove it's like my referral?
No, you just need a referral agreement.
And that's on zip forms, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And is that universal depending on like what state it is or brokerage even?
What do you mean go ahead, Steph,
You can actually, we have a, it doesn't matter.
a form.
we've
Okay.
got a form. I'm gonna send you the link to the resources tab
Okay,
and our KW. I put it in the chat section if you want to pick that up.
okay, got you.
If you scroll to the bottom, there's a KW referral form.
Okay,
So if you're the sending agent, you can fill this out and mark yourself as the sending agent and us as the sending broker. And then they're the receiving broker and receiving agent. And then you'll send them a copy of our W-9 as well, so that they can make sure to pay you.
okay,
That W-9 is also at the bottom of this page.
okay. All
But it
right.
doesn't matter whose form it's on. It just needs to be documented.
Okay, gotcha. And
But you
if that-
don't have to have buyer agency with them.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. I wasn't sure how that, like, if you had to prove you actually had them or as a client or something like that. And then, well, just on that topic, if they're looking to sell and buy, would that be two separate referral transactions or just one?
Are they selling it in Wisconsin?
No, they're looking to sell in Illinois. I'm from Illinois, so I have no clients here.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
A lot in Illinois.
I would for paper trail, I would do two separate. Yeah.
Okay, good to know.
Because
Thank
the
you.
referrals come across as a buyer referral and they come, or a seller referral.
Got it. Awesome. Thanks.
No problem.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, I hope this cleared up the importance of buyer agency. And again, for the working on the agreement itself or working on dialogue that you want to have with the buyer, please contact Steph or me for individual situations that you may be in. We're always happy to help. But buyer agency is important, and I want you to know the importance of it. Okay?
Thank you,
Well, if
guys.
there are no questions, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Awesome job, Joan. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.